The morning of March 3, 1943, dawned deceptively calm over the Bismarck Sea. At 0600 hours, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding the vital L resupply convoy, stood with rigid confidence on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki. Before him, a sight that embodied the Imperial Japanese Navy's dominance. 8 destroyers shepherding 8 fully loaded transport ships through waters that, for more than a year, Japanese naval doctrine asserted belonged unequivocally to the Empire. The convoy was carrying the 51st Division's desperately needed reinforcements: 6,900 soldiers, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and heavy equipment promised to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi at Lae, New Guinea. Kimura had every reason to believe they would arrive safely. Japanese warships had sailed these passages between Rabaul and Lae for months without serious challenge from American surface forces, and the Allied air threat, while constant, had been persistently ineffective against moving ships. What Admiral Kimura could not possibly know, what no Japanese naval officer could imagine even in their darkest nightmares, was that American mechanics, operating out of makeshift workshops in sun-baked Australian airfields, had transformed the conventional medium bomber into something that would turn these very waters into a killing field. Within 4 hours, modified B-25 Mitchell bombers with 8.50 caliber machine guns protruding from their noses like the fangs of some mechanical demon would turn his meticulously organized convoy into burning wreckage scattered across the sea. The Japanese Navy's confidence was rooted in bitter experience and hard-won victories, from Pearl Harbor and the Java Sea to the seeming inability of high-altitude American bombers to hit anything smaller than an island. They believed implicitly in their anti-aircraft guns. Captain Tamatsu Tamiya, commanding the destroyer Shikinami, and likely the most experienced destroyer commander in the formation, had sailed these waters repeatedly. He knew the Americans had tried everything: high-level bombing from B-17 flying fortresses that rarely achieved a direct hit, cumbersome torpedo attacks requiring long, straight approaches that made the attacking aircraft perfect targets, and medium-altitude bombing that gave ships plenty of time to maneuver away from falling bombs. The IJN had developed specific doctrine-approved tactics for dealing with aerial threats: rapid, short-burst evasive maneuvers, concentrated 25mm anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships, and fighter cover from the 11th Air Fleet based at Rabaul. These tactics had worked well enough that Admiral Gunichi Mikawa approved this convoy, despite knowing the Americans would detect its movement. Japanese naval officers understood aerial warfare primarily as a battle between ships and traditional horizontal bombers or torpedo planes, encounters where disciplined anti-aircraft fire and sharp maneuvering could defeat most attacks. Aboard the destroyer Tokitsukaze, Commander Yasumi Doi had drilled his gun crews relentlessly, teaching them to concentrate their 25mm cannons on approaching aircraft, to lead their targets properly, and to maintain steady fire even when under attack. The convoy's anti-aircraft defenses included over 125 of the fast-firing 25mm guns, dozens of 13mm machine guns, and the 5-inch dual-purpose guns of the destroyers, creating what Japanese doctrine called an umbrella of steel over the ships. The convoy maintained a precise formation, following procedures refined through 2 years of war in the Pacific, with destroyers screening the transports, ready for any aerial or submarine threat. However, the Japanese lookouts who first spotted the American aircraft approaching from the south at 9:45 hours reported what appeared to be a standard American bombing formation: B-17s and B-25s approaching at around 7,000 feet. This was exactly the kind of attack the convoy was prepared for. The Japanese gun crews swung their weapons skyward, calculating deflection and altitude, preparing to throw up the curtain of anti-aircraft fire that had protected so many convoys before. But they did not yet see the other aircraft, the B-25 Mitchells approaching at wave-top height, modified in ways the Japanese naval architects could not conceive. The modification of B-25 Mitchell bombers into strafer gunships represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the entire Pacific War. It was born from pure frustration with the ineffectiveness of conventional bombing against fast-moving ships. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, known universally as Pappy Gunn, a former Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces officer, understood that hitting ships from high altitude was nearly impossible, and that the Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific did not have the specialized torpedo aircraft or training needed for effective torpedo runs. Working with North American Aviation Field Representative Jack Fox at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, Gunn began experimenting. The idea was simple but radical. Remove the bombardier position, gut the nose, and install additional .50 caliber machine guns firing directly forward. Through trial and error, the design evolved from 4 to an unprecedented 8.50 caliber guns in the nose, a flying arsenal. This required extensive reinforcement of the aircraft's nose structure, creative additional ammunition storage, and meticulous weight distribution. Challenges that Gunn, Fox, and their tireless mechanics solved through sheer tenacity, fueled by the urgent need to halt Japanese logistics. The era of the commerce destroyer had begun. The secret to the B-25 Mitchell strafer's terrifying effectiveness lay in the brutal synergy of its new configuration and a revolutionary low-altitude attack technique. Major Pappy Gunn and his mechanics didn't just add guns. They engineered a weapon system tailored for destruction at close quarters. The .50 caliber machine guns chosen for these modifications fired the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round. This was not a simple bullet. It was a 619-grain projectile that traveled at 2,910 feet per second, fast enough to penetrate the deck and superstructure armor of destroyers and, crucially, to ignite fuel and ammunition with its incendiary core. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute, meaning a synchronized blast from all 8 nose guns unleashed an infernal stream of 6,800 rounds per minute. This was not just volume of fire, it was a concentrated, horizontal saw of destruction that could literally tear through a ship's superstructure, obliterate anti-aircraft positions, and kill exposed crew members before they could even react. The psychological effect of facing this weapon was as devastating as its physical damage. Japanese sailors who survived these attacks would later describe the terror of seeing a B-25's nose instantly light up with muzzle flashes, knowing that hundreds of armor-piercing rounds were about to shred their ship. This overwhelming forward firepower was complemented perfectly by the development of skip bombing tactics. This technique, pioneered by Major William G. Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group using B-17s, required pilots to fly straight and level toward their targets at extremely low altitude, between 200 and 250 feet above the water. Bombs dropped at this height and at a precise speed would literally skip like stones across the water's surface, bouncing directly into the sides of the ships or exploding close enough below the waterline to cause catastrophic damage. The technique was revolutionary because it solved the problem of accuracy that plagued high-altitude bombing. Where bombs dropped from 20,000 feet might miss a moving ship by hundreds of yards, a skip bomb aimed from 200 feet was almost guaranteed to hit its target. The catch was the incredible courage required. Pilots had to fly directly into the maw of the ship's anti-aircraft defenses, making themselves perfect targets. To master this, pilots practiced endlessly against the wreck of the SS Pruth on a reef near Port Moresby, learning to judge distances, speeds, and release points until they could consistently skip bombs into the target. General George C. Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, recognized the transformative potential of combining Gunn's strafer modifications with Benn's skip bombing tactics. He ordered the conversion of 3 full squadrons, creating what he called commerce destroyers that could devastate Japanese shipping. By March 1943, The 3rd Attack Group had fully converted to the strafer configuration, with the 91st Bombardment Squadron commanded by Major Edward "Eddie" Larner leading the way in developing the attack tactics that maximized the 8-gun nose. The standard attack profile was a masterpiece of coordinated aggression. B-25s would approach at 1,000 to 1,500 feet, then drop sharply to wavetop height, about 50 feet, approximately 2 miles from the target. They accelerated to maximum speed while the pilot aligned his aircraft with the target ship. At 1,500 yards out, the pilot would open fire with all 8 nose guns, literally hosing the target with a torrent of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The initial strafing run served a dual purpose. It suppressed and often outright destroyed the ship's anti-aircraft gunners, and it killed the bridge crew and helmsmen, ensuring the ship could not take evasive action. Only after the ship's defenses were annihilated would the pilot maintain his approach for the skip bombing run, releasing 1 or 2 500-pound bombs set with a 4 to 6 second delay fuse to ensure deep penetration before detonation. This combination, first the paralyzing strafe, then the devastating bomb, was a tactical innovation for which the Imperial Japanese Navy had absolutely no counter. It was a perfect blend of American mechanical ingenuity and battlefield adaptation, turning a lumbering medium bomber into the most effective anti-shipping weapon of the war. The first indication Admiral Kimura had that something unprecedented was about to happen came when the high-altitude B-17, flying at 7,000 feet, began their bombing runs. As intended by the American planners, the B-17 immediately drew the attention of every Japanese anti-aircraft gun in the convoy. The destroyer crews performed exactly as trained, throwing up a spectacular barrage of 25mm and 5-inch fire. Their tracers created a deadly visible pattern in the sky around the high-flying American bombers, exactly where the Japanese expected the danger to be. This was the critical moment of the American deception. While every Japanese eye watched the predictable, high-altitude threat, and while every gun barrel pointed skyward, a second, more lethal wave was approaching. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and 12 B-25 Mitchell strafers of the 3rd Attack Group were skimming the ocean surface from the southwest. They approached at wavetop height, so low that their propeller wash created spray patterns on the water surface, concealing them from the Japanese lookouts focused on the clouds above. The Luftwaffe had pioneered low-level anti-shipping attacks, but never with this concentration of forward firepower. Major Edward "Eddie" Larner led the B-25 attack in his Mitchell, nicknamed Ruthless. As he approached the lead destroyer, the Shirayuki, at 280 miles per hour, he could clearly see Japanese sailors on deck pointing at his aircraft in shock and confusion. The Japanese had seen B-25s before, but never configured like this. Never with 8 menacing black holes in the nose where machine guns protruded like accusatory fingers. Never approaching at an altitude where the pilot could see individual terrified faces on the ship's deck. Larner waited until he was just 1,200 yards from the Shirayuki before squeezing the butterfly trigger on his control column. The instant Larner fired, the nose of Ruthless flickered with muzzle flashes, and 8 simultaneous streams of .50 caliber death reached out toward the Japanese destroyer. The tracer rounds, filled with incendiary compound, created solid lines of light between the aircraft and the ship, illuminating the attack with terrifying clarity. The effect on Shirayuki was instantaneous and catastrophic. Hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into her bridge and superstructure at 2,910 feet per second. The bridge windows exploded in showers of glass that shredded anyone standing nearby. The thin armor of the gun shields provided no protection against the .50 caliber rounds, which punched through steel like paper. Within seconds, the destroyer's anti-aircraft guns fell silent as their crews were literally torn apart by the concentrated fire. A Japanese ensign named Takashi Miyata, one of the few survivors from Shirayuki's bridge, would later describe the attack as like being caught in a giant metal cutting saw. watching his captain and most of the bridge crew cut down in seconds by rounds that sparked and flashed as they tore through steel bulkheads. Larner maintained his firing run for 8 relentless seconds, pouring over 900 rounds into Shirayuki before releasing his 2 500-pound bombs. The bombs skipped across the water like flat stones, slamming into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. Fitted with 5-second delay fuses, the bombs penetrated Shirayuki's hull before detonating. The explosions shattered the destroyer's back and opened massive holes that flooded her engine rooms within minutes. As Larner pulled up and away, his gunner spraying the destroyer's deck with his turret-mounted .50 caliber guns, Shirayuki was already listing heavily to port, her crew abandoning their weapons to fight uncontrollable flooding. Behind Larner, 11 more B-25s were selecting targets among the convoy, their pilots amazed at how the Japanese ship seemed paralyzed by this unprecedented form of attack. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, flying the Mitchell the Hag, targeted the transport Kyokusei Maru, walking his 8-gun burst from bow to stern. He watched his tracers punch through the ship's bridge, demolish her forward cargo handling equipment, and silence her anti-aircraft positions before his skip bombs tore into her hull. The transport's captain, trying frantically to maneuver away from the attack, found his helm unresponsive. The helmsman and most of the bridge crew were dead, cut down by the relentless .50 caliber rounds that had turned the bridge into a charnel house of shattered bodies and twisted metal. The bowfighters added to the carnage, their 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 caliber machine guns focusing on anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews, suppressing any attempt at organized defense. The initial, overwhelming success of the surprise attack quickly led to the complete collapse of the Japanese defensive system. The low-flying B-25 strafers and bowfighters had achieved the impossible. They had silenced the formidable anti-aircraft fire of the destroyer screen, leaving the vulnerable transport ships exposed to close-range, methodical destruction. The Japanese pilots, trained to evade high-altitude bombers, found themselves unable to cope with an attack that combined simultaneous strafing and skip bombing at mast height. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, having crippled the Kyokusei Maru, was now just one element in a concerted assault. The transport's captains, frantically trying to execute the standard evasive maneuvers of turning sharply to spoil a bomb run, found their orders went unanswered. The 50 caliber streams had instantly decapitated the command structure. The typical bridge, built with thin steel plating and large windows for visibility, offered no defense against the torrent of 6,800 rounds per minute. Helmsmen, navigators, and communication officers were cut down in the first seconds, leaving the large, sluggish transport ships literally drifting out of control. The transports themselves became a primary focus. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy, flying a bowfighter of No. 30 Squadron RAAF, made his approach toward the transport Taiyo Maru at 500 feet, diving to mast height in the final seconds while his 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 caliber machine guns tore into the ship's superstructure. Cassidy would later describe watching the ship's bridge kind of disintegrate under the impact of the 20mm explosive rounds, seeing Japanese sailors thrown into the air by explosions, and watching lifeboats shatter into kindling as his rounds found them. The skip bombing proved devastatingly effective, exploiting the transport's vulnerability at the waterline. With the anti-aircraft fire suppressed, the B-25 pilots could maintain a precise line of attack. Bomb after bomb bounced across the water, slamming into Japanese hulls at the waterline. The delayed action fuses were the final, fatal stroke, ensuring the 500-pound bombs penetrated deep into the hull before exploding. The transport Nojima took 3 skip bomb hits in rapid succession. The explosions opened her hull like a giant can opener, flooding her holds where hundreds of 51st Division soldiers were packed into spaces meant for cargo. These troops, wearing full combat gear, had virtually no chance of escaping the rapidly flooding compartments. Witnesses, including surviving Japanese sailors and later Allied airmen, described the horrifying scene of the holds filling with water. Even over the roar of aircraft engines and exploding ammunition, some heard the screams of the doomed soldiers trapped below. Aboard the destroyer Tokitsukaze, Commander Yasumi Doi watched in horror as his carefully trained gun crews were swept away by continuous streams of 50-caliber fire. Their bodies were literally torn apart by the heavy-caliber rounds. He tried desperately to organize a defense, shouting orders to redirect fire toward the low-flying attackers. But his gunners were being killed faster than they could respond. Those who survived were too terrified to stand at their posts as B-25s approached with their noses flickering with continuous muzzle flashes. The Japanese Navy had never trained for this. They had never imagined that medium bombers could be turned into flying battleships bristling with forward-firing guns. Nor had they developed tactics to counter an attack that combined strafing and bombing at wavetop height simultaneously. The destroyer Arashio attempted a heroic, if futile, gesture by maneuvering between the attacking aircraft and the transports. Her captain tried to shield the vulnerable cargo ships with his warship, but this only made her a priority target. 3 B-25s immediately concentrated their fire on Arashio. Their combined 24 guns poured over 2,000 rounds per minute into the destroyer, turning her superstructure into twisted metal. This barrage killed everyone on her bridge, destroyed her fire control systems, and left her rudder jammed hard to starboard. Out of control, the crippled Arashio collided violently with the transport Nojima. Both ships locked together as uncontrollable fires spread between them, their crews unable to fight the flames or separate the doomed vessels effectively. Admiral Kimura, watching from his own flagship, the Shirayuki, as his convoy disintegrated around him, struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The attack was unlike anything in Japanese naval experience or doctrine. The Americans were not following any recognized pattern. They were not making predictable torpedo runs or dropping bombs from altitude. Instead, they were boring in at point-blank range with automatic weapons that turned his ships into slaughterhouses. The transport Oyamaru became a particular focus of attack when her captain made the fatal mistake of turning to present her broadside to approaching B-25s, giving them a perfect, expansive target. Lieutenant Donald McCullough, flying Sleepy Time Gal, approached from the beam, opening fire at 1,500 yards. His 8 guns sent a dense stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into Oyamaru's hull at the waterline. The rounds penetrated the ship's side, starting massive fires in her cargo holds where ammunition and fuel were stored, creating secondary explosions that blew out entire sections of her hull. McCullough's skip bombs finished what his guns started, breaking the Oyamaru in half. The ship sank so quickly that most of her 1,500 embarked soldiers had no chance to escape. The main assault lasted only 15 minutes, but in that brief, brutal time, the carefully organized convoy became a scattered collection of burning, sinking wrecks. The destroyer Asagumo, attempting to rescue survivors, was herself attacked by 2 B-25s, whose guns swept her decks clear of personnel before skip bombs blew holes in her hull. Japanese sailors in the water watched in terror as B-25s made strafing runs on lifeboats and swimmers, the American pilots following strict orders to prevent any Japanese reinforcements from reaching New Guinea. By 10:15 a.m. on March 3, 1943, as the last B-25 strafer disappeared toward the south, Admiral Kimura surveyed the devastation around him and realized that the Imperial Japanese Navy had just experienced something that would fundamentally change naval warfare in the Pacific. The carnage was absolute. Of his 8 transports, all were sinking or sunk, their positions marked by burning funeral pyres as they slipped beneath the waves, taking with them the supplies and equipment desperately needed at Leh. 4 of his 8 destroyers were gone, including the flagship Shirayuki. The surviving destroyers were heavily damaged, their decks covered with dead and wounded, their superstructures riddled with thousands of .50 caliber holes. The human cost was horrific. Of the 6,900 troops who had sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would eventually reach Leh, most of these rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived after dark. The majority of the 51st Division had been destroyed not in ground combat, where they could fight back, nor by naval gunfire, where they might have had warning, but by modified medium bombers that turned their transports into death traps in minutes. Captain Tomatsu Tamiya, one of the few senior officers to survive, would later write that the attack was like nothing we had ever experienced or imagined possible, describing how the B-25 seemed to saw our ships in half with their concentrated firepower. The end of a doctrine. The psychological impact on the Imperial Japanese Navy proved even greater than the physical losses. News of the convoy's complete annihilation spread quickly through the fleet. Naval officers who had long dismissed American high-altitude bombing as ineffective were forced to confront the terrifying reality that the Americans had developed a weapon against which their traditional naval defenses were useless. The heart of the problem was a doctrinal failure. Japanese naval strategy was centered on surface engagements and expected aerial attacks to be either high-level, horizontal bombing or predictable torpedo runs. They had no counter for flying gunships that could deliver the firepower of a surface vessel at the speed and flexibility of an aircraft. The 8.50 caliber guns in each B-25's nose represented more concentrated forward-firing automatic weapons than most destroyers carried. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, received the report of the Bismarck Sea disaster with visible shock. He understood immediately that Japan could no longer risk surface vessels in waters within range of American aircraft. The Navy's inability to protect even a heavily escorted convoy meant that reinforcement and resupply of forward positions would become almost impossible, effectively dooming Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Yamamoto ordered an immediate review of convoy procedures, but privately admitted to his staff that there might be no effective counter to the American strafer bombers. Psychological scars. The 8 eyes of death. For the Japanese soldiers and sailors who survived the encounter, the psychological scars were deep and debilitating. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, a survivor from the transport Kyokusei Maru, described recurring nightmares about the American planes with 8 eyes of death, unable to forget the sight of his shipmates being literally torn apart by the .50 caliber fire. Commander Toshio Abe, who witnessed the massacre from a rescue destroyer, reported that his crew became paralyzed with fear whenever they heard aircraft engines, knowing that B-25 strafers could appear at any moment. The effectiveness of the B-25 strafer forced fundamental changes in Japanese strategic planning, as commanders now had to assume that any daylight movement would be detected and attacked. Operations that would have been routine in 1942 became impossible by late 1943. The famous Tokyo Express destroyer runs to Guadalcanal represented one prior adaptation, using speed and darkness to avoid air attack. However, even these high-speed, nighttime runs suffered losses when B-25 strafers, now equipped with rudimentary radar, began hunting at night. By early 1944, Japanese naval officers were writing classified reports describing the B-25 strafer as the most feared weapon in the Pacific, more devastating than submarines, more accurate than dive bombers, and more flexible than torpedo planes. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, admitted that the Imperial Navy had no effective defense against mass strafer attacks, recommending that surface vessels avoid operating within 500 miles of American air bases. This effectively conceded vast areas of the Pacific to American control, accelerating Japan's strategic retreat and eventual defeat by preventing the concentration of forces. The success of the B-25 Mitchell strafer transcended a single battle. It represented the triumph of American mechanical ingenuity and industrial capacity over rigid military doctrine. The transformation of a conventional medium bomber into a gunship was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering, born not from pre-war planning, but from the urgent, practical needs of warfare. Major Pappy Gunn, working with limited resources and in primitive conditions at Eagle Farm Airfield, created a weapon that would prove more effective against shipping than many purpose-built attack aircraft. His simple innovation, putting overwhelming forward firepower into a reliable, fast airframe, demonstrated the American talent for innovation and adaptation that was crucial to victory. The evolution of the gunship. The 8-gun nose modification proved so successful that North American Aviation incorporated Gunn's field modifications into factory production. The B-25J series, the ultimate strafer variant, could carry up to 18.50 caliber forward-firing machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in the wings, and 6 in the tail fuselage side packs, 2 in the top turret, 2 in waist positions, and 2 in the tail. This late-war variant was a flying arsenal capable of delivering devastating firepower from multiple angles, cementing the B-25's reputation as a commerce destroyer that could annihilate entire convoys single-handedly. Following the Bismarck Sea victory, B-25 strafers spread throughout the Southwest Pacific. The 345th Bombardment Group, known as the Air Apaches, received B-25 strafers in August 1943 and immediately began hunting Japanese coastal traffic around New Guinea. Their aircraft, decorated with distinctive shark mouths and aggressive nose art, became synonymous with death to Japanese sailors. The 38th Bombardment Group converted to strafers and even developed new tactics for night attacks using radar to locate targets in complete darkness. By late 1943, Japanese naval officers reported that daylight movement of anything larger than a fishing boat had become suicidal in waters within B-25 range. The impact on Japanese logistics was catastrophic. The Navy was forced to rely increasingly on submarines and fast destroyers running at night, methods that could only deliver a fraction of what surface convoys could carry. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific began to suffer chronic shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The garrison at Leh, which the March 3rd convoy was meant to reinforce, never received adequate supplies and was eventually evacuated in September 1943. The soldiers were forced to march through dense jungle and mountains, suffering massive casualties from starvation and disease. Defiance and doctrinal shift. The Japanese attempts to counter the B-25 strafers proved largely ineffective. The aircraft's speed and devastating firepower made them difficult targets for fighters, while their low-altitude attacks negated the effectiveness of heavy anti-aircraft guns. Desperate measures, such as suicide attacks by fighters attempting to ram the B-25s, were attempted, but could not stop the steady attrition. By mid-1944, the Japanese merchant marine had lost over 60% of its tonnage, much of it to B-25 strafers and skip-bombing attacks. The B-25 strafer also proved its versatility against airfields. The August 17 to 21, 1943 raids on WWII demonstrated this, as B-25 strafers destroyed over 170 Japanese aircraft on the ground in a series of low-level attacks that left the Japanese Fourth Air Army virtually helpless. Japanese pilots described the horror of watching B-25s approach at treetop level, their nose guns destroying everything in their path. The effectiveness of the B-25 strafer forced fundamental changes in Japanese strategic planning. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome admitted in a classified report that the Imperial Navy had no effective defense against mass strafer attacks, recommending that surface vessels avoid operating within 500 miles of American air bases. This concession, granting vast areas of the Pacific to American control, was a clear sign that the war's initiative had been definitively lost. A lasting legacy. Japanese military historians writing after the war acknowledged that the B-25 strafer represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War, comparable to the impact of radar or code breaking. Professor Masanori of the Japanese Defense University wrote that the strafer bomber destroyed not just their ships but our entire concept of naval warfare, forcing Japan to abandon offensive operations earlier than would otherwise have been necessary. The inability to protect shipping from strafer attack accelerated Japan's defeat by preventing the concentration of forces for counteroffensives. The impact of the B-25 strafer extends beyond its immediate tactical success, influencing post-war aircraft design and military doctrine. The concept of a heavily armed gunship proved so successful that it leads directly to the development of aircraft like the AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre gunships used in later conflicts. The integration of massive forward firepower in an aircraft designed for other purposes became a standard American military practice, traced directly back to Pappy Gunn's modifications in the workshops of Australia. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, therefore, was not merely an engagement. It was a paradigm shift. It was the moment that the United States demonstrated that a combination of relentless industrial output and ingenious adaptation could defeat a disciplined enemy relying on outdated doctrine. The B-25 Mitchell strafer was the technological wedge that drove the final decisive nail into the coffin of Japan's sea-based logistical power.